Okay, Happy New Year to everybody. Welcome to the January 2025 meeting of the 1904 World's Fair Society. I'm Mike Truax, and this year marks the 121st anniversary of the 1904 World's Fair and 39th anniversary of our society. I want to welcome you all that are in the room here for coming tonight after the big winter storm postponed our meeting for 24 hours. I don't think anybody would have, gone out yesterday. They were still finding their cars covered in ice and stuff like that. And it's cold, but it could be colder, I guess. And it's going to get colder tonight and tomorrow night. Tonight we have a new presentation from a first-time author. I think you all have read about him in the bulletin and on the announcement. We also have a couple of very nice pieces of World's Fair memorabilia, two souvenir spoons from the fair. One's the Palace of Electricity, and the other one is the Palace of Mines and Metallurgy. And Garrett's going to bring those up to me and the box here in a little while. And we'll have a drawing after the presentation, and Andy will draw a couple of names out of a hat, out of the box. So how many that are online came to the banquet last December 1st? Raise your hand or put your hand up to your camera or something like that. As we reported in the bulletin, 7 members of the executive board were either reelected or reappointed, and one director has retired, Holly Childress, and she's been replaced by our librarian, Garrett Koch, who's also going to continue to be a librarian. He's in the back of the room and helping as the sergeant of arms and the gatekeeper back there. I also want to, besides the board and the 4 elected people, myself, Mary Ellen Dick, David Meyer, and Treasurer Art Daviar, we also appointed 3 other directors, Linda Daviar, Doug Stone, and Nan Vortree. And there's 2 other key members of the Society's executive board that really help the Society work, and that's the bulletin editor, Jana Meehan, and the assistant treasurer and secretary for membership, Sharon Mercer. She's the one that takes your dues and mails you a new member package or makes sure that our roster is accurate and we get the bulletins sent out to everybody. A few quick administrative reminders. If you're in the room here, please silence your phone. No pictures are allowed and no flash, please. A reminder for all Zoom attendees, you can ask questions by entering them into the chat area of Zoom, which you have to click on the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And we'll be watching the chat room for questions from our attendees. I don't know if David was able to get online, but Doug is online. He'll be watching for that. Please do check out the Society's Facebook group page. There's over 7,500 members, and there's always postings about World's Fair events, memories, and memorabilia, and questions and news about the World's Fair. Our Instagram account has over 1,200 followers, I think, and we see frequent posts of unusual views of the fair from Holly over the last few years, and Garrett's going to keep that going. Links for both of these pages are at the bottom of the Society's webpage, which is 1904worldsfairsociety.org. I'm sure everybody here has signed up for the attendance prizes, and be sure and stay for the drawing. I have one other announcement I want to tell people about that I just found out about in the last couple of days. The History Museum is going to have a presentation next Tuesday, January 14th at 11 a.m. The Chinese government and the American counterpart were working their way through colonialism, imperialism, diplomacy, and globalization. St. Louis professor Zhao Ma will explore the documented personal stories from the 1904 World's Fair and the carefully curated representation of China that World's Fair organizers designed specifically to appeal to an American audience, because we used to view China as an old regime with exotic culture but outdated civilization. So I'm looking forward to that, and we'll report on that. So now I'd like to look back to Monday, January 7th, 1904, 121 years ago today. The fair's opening was less than 4 months away, and there was an incredible amount of work remaining to be completed. Here's a few news events that I didn't know about, and I bet they're news to you too. The fair's emergency hospital opened. It was located near the location where the 250-foot wireless telegraph tower would rise, and at the end of the Plaza of Orleans and Model Street. Today, that location is right where the tennis courts are near the Dwight Davis Tennis Center. Let's see, 2 ambulances were kept on standby for emergencies. Many of the Philippine, Moro, and Igorot tribesmen were the first users of the facility because they found out they were suffering from beriberi. In the room here, how many people know what beriberi is? 1, 2 out of a dozen. Beriberi is a thiamine deficiency disease caused by a diet of too much rice and little or no vegetables or protein supplements. That's what I learned. David R. Francis, the president of the LPE, would have his own flag, the Globe reported. It would fly over the fair's administration building, now Brookings Hall, whenever Francis was in. It was similar to the LPE flag. It had a white fleur-de-lis and a vertical bar near the staff, but it would have only 2 horizontal bars, red and yellow. The LPE flag had 3 bars, red, white, and yellow. And I didn't know that. I've never seen a picture of that flag. Fair officials were amused at a letter from a Russian man, Petrovo Renev. He asked for exhibit space to show his device for producing rain. And he asked for an advance of 100 rubles. He gave no explanation about how it worked, but he said he had heard that the U.S. was suffering from a terrible drought. Needless to say, his request was ignored. And I want to make sure we're recording, and as I get on to introduce our presenter, Andy Hahn, he'll present, I guess, from the podium, and we'll get this microphone up next to him. Andy Hahn is a 7th-generation St. Louisan who has been passionate about history and maps since he was a kid. He attended St. Louis University. He interned at the Couples House on the SLU campus, where he was bitten by the old house bug. Since 2003, he has worked as the director of the Campbell House Museum, an 1851 townhouse in downtown St. Louis. So I'm going to give the microphone to Andy, and I'm going to do a few magic things here to get the presentation full screen going out to the Zooms.
Thank you, Mike. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, let's go back to the beginning. And I can see my screen. And like that.
All right.
Okay, Doug, I can't see you, but how's it looking?
Looks great, Mike.
Okay,
Looks great.
Okay.
thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out, person or on Zoom. As Mike said, my name is Andy Hahn, and it is my goal to share with you a story or a brief history of St. Louis through the lens of maps. It's been really fascinating for me to see how many people in the world, how many people in our community are interested in maps. There's something that have held a fascination for me since from the time I was a little kid. Maps have always had a special allure, have always drawn me in, not only as pieces of information that tell you where you are in your city or your world or in a particular building, but they are oftentimes fabulous pieces of design as well. So I'll just go ahead and advance this, Mike.
Just hit the space bar. Or the right button. Or click.
There we go.
Okay. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I've got a double duty tonight.
So I begin my presentation kind of with a short tale of two houses, because that's where my fascination of maps kind of roots. This is the first house. This is my grandparents' house in Webster Groves on Oakwood Avenue. They lived here for over 50 years, and in the study of this house was a map. It was Hammond's 1958 International Map of the World. In my memory, this map was humongous, but it was probably only about 5 feet wide. It hung on, like I said, the study of their living room, or of the wall of their study, rather. It was something they really committed to. They did not frame it and hang it on the wall. They did not tack it to the wall. They actually used wallpaper paste and pasted it to the wall. They wanted it to go up there and be a permanent feature of the house. And it was there until the day my grandmother sold the house. Later, my grandfather even built a little frame around it. He cut some molding and tacked it on there. In their retirement, my grandparents went all over the world. And when they would come back from a trip, they would describe where they had been to me on this map. And so this map always fascinated me. I was fascinated by Greenland, how big it was, the lines connecting the different places on the map, the oceans, the shapes. So this was my kind of first real exposure to maps from the time I was a little kid. So next slide, Mike.
Enter. Which
I
did you do?
I did the right arrow.
Okay.
That looks hopeful, Mike.
There we go.
Okay.
All right. So this is the second house. This is where I work, the Campbell House Museum. I've been fortunate enough to be the steward of this building for the last 20 years. And every day in this building, we used maps to explain the history of this house, of the neighborhood to visitors. Let's see if this works. There we go. Perfect. This is one of those maps we use. It is a map of St. Louis from 1855. This is actually the first map of St. Louis produced specifically for an atlas. The first map of the city to be printed and bound in a book with other maps. And get that back. It's also the first map of St. Louis, one of the first to show, if you could advance again, Mike. One of the very first maps to show the new neighborhood of Lucas Place. And that's the neighborhood or the street that the Campbell House was part of when it was constructed. The new neighborhood it was part of in 1851 when it was brand new. Next slide. So when talking about maps, you have to be clear what the map is for. And it was a goal of my book to include a wide variety of maps that tell different aspects to St. Louis's history. There's maps like this one for navigation, maps that a tourist might use if they came to St. Louis. If you came here on a steamboat or a train, you might buy a map like this at the station or on the levee to help you navigate the city. This map, it might be hard to tell, but actually folds over 40 times. And when it's folded up, it's smaller than the palm of your hand, so that can actually easily fit in your pocket of your jacket or your pants. There are maps like this one, planning maps. This map from 1907 that talks about St. Louis and how it might grow in the afterglow of the World's Fair. The city planners, the city government commissioned something called the Civic League Plan, and it's still considered one of the most important and influential urban plans ever created. This comes from that plan, and this is an effort to create a series of greenways that connected important spaces in the city, very similar to what Great Rivers Greenway is still doing today. But I'll remind you, this map is from 1907, and it just goes to show you that there's not a lot of new ideas in the world. If you want to advance again, Mike. There's even fantasy maps included in the book. This is a metro map. If St. Louis was maybe the size of Tokyo or Paris, a sprawling megalopolis. Of course, we don't have that kind of population, and this transit system will never exist. But this is a fantasy of what that might look like. According to this fantasy, you could take a train from Wentzville in the left, top left corner of the map to Carlisle, Illinois on the far right. That's a journey of almost 90 miles. But again, it's a fantasy. So you have to keep in mind what the map is used for. And now we're going to be in kind of a journey of St. Louis history through maps. Oh, one last thing. Before we start our chronological journey, we have to talk about this. And I think everybody knows what this is. It's, of course, the flag of St. Louis. It's only been the flag of our city for about 60 years now. It's probably the most lasting contribution of St. Louis's bicentennial celebration in 1964, a new design for a city flag. It replaced an older city flag, which actually was not dissimilar to the World's Fair flag. There were some similarities to it. I think everyone will agree that this is pretty distinctive and has become an iconic symbol of our city. And as the designer who created this flag noted, it is at heart a map, albeit a very simple and basic map. It shows the city represented by the gold disc with the blue fleur-de-lis in it at the confluence of North America's two greatest rivers, the Missouri and the Mississippi. So I think that's pretty cool. We have a flag that's a map. And I don't know of any other flag anywhere in the world that is a map that shows you that place and how to locate it. Again, albeit very basically. So these are the maps included in the book. There are 40. We're only going to talk briefly about 6 today. There's a whole, like I said, variety of styles of maps, what the map is used for. We talked about tourist maps and transit maps and planning maps. I wanted to choose a variety of those in addition to choosing maps that speak to the city's story chronologically, starting from its colonial era to its early American period, to the fur trade and Western expansion, to the Civil War and the Gilded Age, to World War I and the Great Migration, World War II, and of course, St. Louis as it exists today. So we're going to begin our journey all the way back in 1767. This is the first map to show St. Louis. There are maybe one or two earlier maps that depict St. Louis as a dot on a map, but this is the first map of St. Louis to show the city's street grid. And as Mike has fast forwarded here, you now see right in the middle, it's labeled Payne Court, Village Francois, a series of blocks and streets, and that is the new village of St. Louis, which in 1767 was only a few years old. This map was created by a French-speaking Spanish military officer who was sent to St. Louis in the fall of 1767 to take stock and literally map this new Spanish colony. This map was, as soon as the ink was dry, was sent back down to New Orleans and across the Atlantic Ocean to Madrid, where it still exists today as part of the National Library in Madrid, Spain. So this map also has the distinction of coming from the furthest away. And through most of St. Louis's history, us here in the city didn't know this map existed. This map's really kind of only been known to St. Louisans since the mid-20th century, so it was lost for a long time. And this is one of the first times it's been reproduced in color. So a couple really interesting things about this map that you're seeing on this view. You not only see, of course, for the first time, the blocks and the streets of St. Louis. You see just north of the city and west of the city, big hills or mounds. Those are the famous Indian mounds for which St. Louis was called Mound City by the 19th century. But what you also see across the Mississippi on the east side of the river is the village of Cahokia, which is bigger than the new village of St. Louis. People have been living in Cahokia for at least 7 decades before the village of St. Louis was founded. So it's not surprising that Cahokia is larger and more established than the new village of St. Louis. And just south of St. Louis and Cahokia, you see villages of Peoria Indians encamped and living as well. The next advancement will highlight just west of the village of St. Louis in that red box. You see the only individual structure noted on this map, and this is the new mill. The mill was used to grind flour, and if you like bread and you do not have a mill to grind the flour, it's going to be the grain into flour. It's going to be very difficult to make that bread. So from its earliest days, a mill was built in St. Louis, and just a few months after this map was created, the mill was purchased by Pierre Laclede and later inherited by his children, the Chouteau family. If you want to advance, Mike. That mill would and its subsequent construction would be an important feature on any early St. Louis map. When I mean early, for almost 100 years. This photograph from about 1855 shows that mill. Now, keep in mind, this photograph was taken almost 100 years after the map we just looked at was made. And in fact, in this photograph, the mill is actually probably being demolished because by the middle of the 19th century, it was no longer a necessary or practical thing. But in the process of expanding the mill, Pierre Laclede dammed a little creek, which they just called the Little River in early colonial St. Louis. And in damming that little river, he made a pond. That pond would be called Chouteau's Pond, and that's what you see on this map from about 1800. Along the bottom, you see the blocks and the streets of St. Louis, and to the west of the city, and when we to the west, we're only talking about 7 blocks west of the city, you see this pond. If you want to advance again, Mike. Closer up, you actually see it labeled Chouteau's Mill, and that's the little square right in the middle. And where you see that cross hatching along the edge of the pond, that's actually the dam that was made to create the pond. Like I said, about its first 80 years, the pond was a central feature of the landscape of St. Louis. This view from about 1840, rather romantic, shows the skyline of St. Louis from across Chouteau's Pond. This is looking from the west towards the east. You see the skyline and the steeples of St. Louis's churches. The largest one right in the middle is the Second Presbyterian Church. But as the artist has depicted, that pond became a spot for recreation for early St. Louisans. You see in the foreground on the left a man sitting in a top hat sketching or drawing. You see someone fishing. You see a group of men rowing in the background. Even someone in a fishing boat further in the background. Whether the pond ever looked this kind of picturesque and idyllic is up for debate, but it was something that people used quite heavily as part of recreation, a beauty spot. Not too long after this print was made, the city grew up around the pond. And as many of you probably know, the pond became quite polluted when people were living up next to it. And by the mid-1850s, the pond was drained, the mill was torn down, and the streets of St. Louis would continue over the spot where the pond once stood. The pond basically began on the east end where Busch Stadium is today and traveled to the southwest along what's now Walnut Street in downtown St. Louis. That's the story of Chouteau's Pond. Now we're going to fast forward to 1837. I think this is one of the most fascinating maps of St. Louis ever created. This is a map of St. Louis's harbor. This map was created to study and hopefully help solve a problem. Advance the slide, Mac. 20 years before this map was made, the first steamboat came to St. Louis in the late 18 teens, in 1817 to be exact. And by the 1830s, steamboats like the one you see here in the illustration called the Meteor were plying the rivers up and down the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, and quickly making St. Louis a huge hub for trade. By 1835, St. Louis had become, as designated by the federal government, a port of foreign entry. meaning that goods from foreign countries could be shipped directly to St. Louis, offloaded, and it was a major coup for commerce here in St. Louis. Steamboats were bringing thousands of people and tens of thousands of pounds of goods to St. Louis every year. And year over year, those numbers were increasing exponentially. However, there was a huge problem. If you want to advance the slide again, Mike. Oh, advance it one more time. There was a huge problem. As you can see here, you see the street grid at the top of the screen. And the problem was the river, as it flowed from the right side of your picture to the left, was beginning to silt up in front of the levee, particularly at the south end of the levee. That was considered the entrance to the harbor and the point of entry for most of the boats. However, the water was dumping silt, mud, and dirt. Naturally, big rivers like the Mississippi want to move and change over time. And what was happening was just a natural current. The river was wanting to kind of drift away from the Missouri side towards the Illinois side. And it was making the levee, the water at the levee at St. Louis, very shallow. There were times in 1836 where the entrance to the harbor, the water was only 4 feet deep. This was an enormous problem if you're going to try to pull a huge boat up here. Can you go back, Mike? I don't know how you did that before.
Go back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like we do today, the federal government was called in to help, and this is who the federal government sent in. This is Lieutenant Robert E. Lee. And it's, yes, that Robert E. Lee from Civil War fame. In 1837, he was a young military officer and considered one of the finest military engineers in the United States. He was sent to St. Louis to fix the problem. You can advance the slide, Mike. And he actually drew this map. This is Robert E. Lee's map of the harbor at St. Louis. The first thing that he did was he had to study the problem, and that's what this map represents. This map represents his study. You see these diagonal intersecting and crossing what look like lines. If you want to advance the slide again, Mike. What are actually lines are numbers, and those are depth soundings. Lee had to understand exactly how deep the river was, what the bottom of the river looked like to try and fix the problem. And as you can see on the left hand of your screen, at the south end of the levee, the numbers get shallower and shallower to the point where they're as shallow, at least here, as 5 feet. And this is in normal water. In low water, it would get even shallower. So this was the problem that Lee had to fix. He knew that, no, you want to go back a little bit, sorry. He knew that there was no way that dredging could fix this problem. You could dredge it out and the flow of the river would just dump all that mud, silt, and sand right back where you had dredged it from. The only way to fix the problem was to force the river to go in a certain direction. So the goal was, and Lee's design and plan was to make the fast current of the river flow as close to the levee as possible. And to do this, he designed a series of dikes, or we might today call levees, to focus the control or the flow of the river. So as you see in this view off the end of Bloody Island, you see a long straight line. And if you could squint and read that on your screen, it actually says proposed dike. What wasn't proposed, he actually did build this dike. It was made merely by dumping stones, big stones into the river. And when you have enough of them, you will actually build them up out of the water about 10 feet. It was a big job because all this had to be done without, big heavy machinery. Stones loaded on boats and dumped into the river. It took about 3 years to build this, but it almost instantly began to show success. And by the fall of 1840, the entrance to the harbor was already beginning to deepen. It was considered an enormous success. And within 25 years, the large island you see on the left hand of the view, you could just see the tip of the island. It was called Duncan's Island. Lee's work was such a success that Duncan's Island was swept away by the river completely. It was completely washed away. So that's the story of St. Louis's harbor. We're going to fast forward about 25 years to the Civil War. Now, St. Louis was at a very unique position during at the start of the Civil War. As many of you are probably aware, Missouri was a slave state that never seceded from the Union. Interestingly enough, that made Missouri one of the very last places that slavery was legal in the United States. St. Louis, being Missouri's largest city, was a huge center of manufacturing, particularly things made out of metal and of leather. Both goods or commodities that are very useful to armies. There was a huge amount of shot or bullets made here in St. Louis. So a big manufacturing center. St. Louis was at a dominant place on the river. It was the most dominant hub or port on the upper Mississippi River and controlled everything from here north. But perhaps most important, St. Louis was an important base of military operations. Just south of what's now downtown St. Louis, and you can fast forward the next slide, Mike. Just south of downtown St. Louis, which you can see here now on the left of your screen, and which is still there today, was the United States Arsenal. That arsenal goes all the way back to the 1830s, and historians have estimated that at the early days of the Civil War, there could have been as many as 50,000 rifles stored at the United States Arsenal at St. Louis. That was a pretty attractive prize. And of course, just south of St. Louis was Jefferson Barracks, which was one of the largest army installations in the United States, especially since the Mexican-American War, since Jefferson Barracks had become a key staging point for soldiers to go down to Mexico. Jefferson Barracks had become a key and important military installation or fort here in the United States. Of course, St. Louis is close to the frontier. So to guarantee that the city would not fall to the Confederacy and to protect not only the people, but the manufacturing assets and the military assets of St. Louis, the Army and the federal government constructed a series of 10 earthenworks forts that ringed the city. Is kind of a forgotten part of our Civil War history. They were all quite large, at least 300 feet long, some as almost over 400 feet. They were earthenworks, meaning imagine a group of men just showing up with shovels and carts and starting to dig ditches and then pile that dirt in big piles. And when the pile of dirt got to be about 30 feet tall, they would put guns, big cannons on the top of it, and that consisted of the fort. The inside of the fort was hollowed out, and there was a space in there for a contingent of men who staffed the fort to live, so this fort could be manned 24/7. They weren't very creative in the naming of these forts, and as you can see here on this map, you see forts numbers 2, 3, and 4, and 5. There were 10 in total. Although there were a number of smaller installations called redoubts and redans. So there was actually more like 16 that ringed the city. They started on the south, basically at Chippewa and South Broadway, went up along what's now Jefferson Avenue, almost to North Grand and Broadway. So a pretty impressive line of fortifications. You can fast forward, Mike. In researching this book, I was kind of surprised to find that still preserved in the Library of Congress are the detailed schematics for every one of these forts that show us the distinct shapes and designs of each one of these. So you see a layout of the fort, and then on the right side of this drawing, you actually see a cross section showing the walls and the inside of the fort as well. Fort number 5 was on the western edge of Lafayette Park. If you can imagine Lafayette Park today, it basically went from Park Avenue to Lafayette Avenue and sat over what's now the streets of Albion and Whittemore Place, and actually even extended over today what's Jefferson Avenue. If you fast forward, Mike. These forts were pretty formidable, and it's probably at least one of the reasons why St. Louis was never successfully attacked during the war. And after the war, these forts didn't disappear. It took many decades for some of them to be kind of wiped off the map, so to speak. This view from 1875, 10 years after the war, shows the remnants of Fort Number 5. You can see highlighted here this kind of ditch, and that's kind of all that's left at Fort Number 5. Over the next 10 years, that would be leveled. Like I said, a neighborhood and streets would be built over that location today. So here we've come all the way to 1904. I'm a little nervous talking about this map because you are the experts about the fair and what you know about the park and the fair during those years. I think, as you probably all are aware, it was the Forest Park was chosen as the site for the 1904 fair. There were a number of other sites in contention, including Carondelet Park, up in North City near O'Fallon Park, and even a site not very far from here in the University City Library, just a little north and east of here. Ultimately, Forest Park was chosen. It was very controversial. I read a number of newspaper accounts that seemed to indicate that most St. Louisans didn't think it was such a great idea. Even in 1904, after its existence for 30 years, Forest Park had become a much loved green space in St. Louis, and St. Louisans didn't want to give that up. But they were able to convince the city, and as part of that, a series of these next series of 3 maps were created to document the park before, during, and after the fair, the plan to restore the park. And I think, as you are all aware, there was no way the city was going to give up the entire park. They only consented to give up half the park for use of the fair. And it's that kind of diagonal weird line that goes right down the center of the map. Yep, Mike's highlighting it right there. Everything to the right or to the east of that would remain untouched. Everything to the left or to the west of that could be used for the fair. I think, as you all know, the fair company quickly decided that that was not big enough. And so they leased another 600 plus acres west of the Forest Park site to create an even larger fair site. But rather than talk about that, I want to talk about some features of the park before, during, and after the fair. That blue squiggly line that makes a very circuitous route through the park. It enters in the top, the northwest corner of the park, and exits through the southeast corner of the park is the River des Peres. It is a natural stream or flowing body of water that in its 19th century form was considered quite idyllic and quite beautiful. Water from the River des Peres was used to create what's called Peninsular Lake and Pagoda Lake. Those are the 2 big lake and the one smaller lake right in the middle of the park. And those became, the major water features. Now, the World's Fair Company saw the River des Peres as a big problem. There was no way that they could design a grand fair and have to deal with this very wiggly body of water running through it. A body of water that, I might add, was prone to flooding on a quite regular basis. If you want to advance the slide, Mike, here you see Peninsular Lake kind of blown up. You see that black dotted line that goes right down the right side. That's the boundaries of the fairgrounds. So you see Peninsular Lake would become the Grand Basin, of course, would be remolded and reshaped, so to speak. But Pagoda Lake on the right side, with the red pagoda in it, that would remain untouched. So kind of a really tight boundary here. If you go to the next slide, Mike, you're going to see the same area during the fair. Now, the River des Peres has been put underground in a temporary sewer or aqueduct, for lack of a better word. It was designed not to be permanent, but was designed to make that flow of water go under the fair and presumably control flood water from the fair itself to exit it. it very abruptly and awkwardly exits the fair site, as you can see on the right side there at the fair boundaries just south of Pagoda Lake. But you see Pagoda Lake remains untouched, and just south of Pagoda Lake and just south of the River des Peres, you see the St. Louis Zoo. The St. Louis Zoo originally stood on what is now the Muni parking lot. From the earliest days of the park's history, from the 1870s, animals were always kept enclosed in the zoo. Originally, it was just buffalo, an antelope, maybe a bear every once in a while. But that's what you see labeled there. You see Deer Park, Elk Park, and those are what would eventually become called the St. Louis Zoo. I want to fast forward again. Oh, actually, can you go back, Mike? The one thing I want to point out, which will become important in the next map, at the very bottom, it's the flight cage. Mike, can you pick that out?
Yeah.
Yeah. Flight cage was part of the fair design. Supposedly cost like $18,000 for the fair company to buy and erect. It was sold to the city of St. Louis for less than $4,000 after the fair, if you want to advance. Here is the same part of the park post fair. You can see River des Peres is still kind of hidden, basically under what had been the Grand Basin. What you now see is the Grand Basin, or just labeled lake, at the bottom of our hill, and Post-Dispatch Lake on the far right. You could still see the remnants kind of that hard line, although the fair boundary is not there anymore. You could certainly tell it by the pattern of trees. The new forest park would have lots more open areas, whereas the old forest park was pretty much exactly as it said. It was mostly a forest with hardly any open areas at all. But the new forest park would be much different. And another map in the book, which I'm not going to talk about today, but the flight cage, which you could see at the bottom, would become the feature for a new St. Louis Zoo. In the 19-teens, the St. Louis Zoo was moved from the area south of Pagoda Lake, where the Muni parking lot is today, to the 75 acres in the southwest corner of Forest Park. We're going to fast forward all the way to 1962. And this is a map of St. Louis from something called the St. Louis Borough Plan. This was an attempt to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. As many of you are probably aware, in 1876, St. Louis City and County separated or divorced themselves from each other. That is why today, while there is a courthouse in downtown St. Louis, and why there is a courthouse in St. Louis County. It's why when you fill out your tax forms and most government forms, there's a spot in there for St. Louis County and St. Louis City, because they are two separate entities. St. Louis is one of only two cities in the United States that exists outside of a county. Chicago is in Cook County. Los Angeles is in Los Angeles County, and so on and so forth. Every major American city, except St. Louis and Baltimore, exists in some kind of larger county. In 1876, residents of the city and county voted to separate themselves. That's a talk for a different day. But by the early 20th century, about 25 years after this divorce, it became clear to many people that maybe that was a little short-sighted. It was perhaps short-sighted to permanently lock the city's boundaries at Skinker Boulevard, essentially, so that the city could not physically grow anymore. Because, of course, after World War II, especially, almost all the growth in our region was west of St. Louis, in St. Louis County. There was a plan in 1926 that went to a vote to basically annex St. Louis County as part of St. Louis City, and divide St. Louis County up into wards, and to create a large St. Louis City, essentially. That was voted down. There was another plan voted on in 1962 that's illustrated by this map. 1962 was seen as the perfect moment to make the city and county come back together. There's a couple reasons for this. After World War II, the city and county had cooperated in three major successful ways. The first is they created the Metropolitan Sewer District. That Metropolitan Sewer District was formed, I think, in 1950 or 51. This was a region-wide St. Louis City and County way to deal with our wastewater and sewage waste. It was considered kind of forward-thinking at the time. It's really just practical. You figure if University City doesn't do a good job with its sewage, whoever is down the line from the University City is going to feel those problems. So the Metropolitan Sewer District took a region-wide approach. It abolished the city sewer department and all these local efforts at dealing with sewage and rainwater. They developed Metro, or what was then called the Bi-State Development Agency. And that was an effort to modernize and streamline and consolidate public transportation in our region through trolleys and buses. In the early 20th century, as is noted in another map in my book, there was a whole host of competing transit companies, sometimes as many as 25 different streetcar companies, each with a different name, each with a different schedule, each with a different fare system. There were still trolleys in the 1950s, and buses were beginning to overtake them. And Metro, the Bi-State Development Agency, today what we call Metro, consolidated and streamlined all of that, not only for St. Louis City and County, but for the Illinois side as well. Lastly, voters in the city and county voted to create the Community College District with campuses in Kirkwood, Florissant, and of course at Forest Park, seen as a huge success. I think everyone can agree on that. So by 1962, this was seen as the next logical step, and this was the St. Louis Borough Plan. This plan went to a public vote, and the goal of the plan was to create what we see here. Mike, if you want to fast forward, you can see it a little bit better. The borough plan would eliminate the city of St. Louis. The territory that was the city of St. Louis would become part of St. Louis County. All city offices in government would become county offices in government. There would be a county-wide executive who would lead the county, and the county would be divided into 22 boroughs of equal size population. Basically follows the model that Indianapolis, Indiana uses today, and that the city of Indianapolis takes up the entire county that it exists. That's what would have happened with this plan. St. Louis would have instantly rocketed up to the sixth largest metropolitan area in the United States, and arguably would have maybe grown and progressed a little bit differently. This was the plan. The boroughs in the counties, what's now St. Louis County and what was then St. Louis County, basically centered around existing municipalities. So names that you might recognize like Bellefontaine, Florissant, Ferguson, University City, Webster Groves, and so on, would form the nucleus of boroughs in the county. The boroughs in the county are much bigger than the ones in the city because these boroughs are all more or less equal in population. In 1962, there were more people living in the city of St. Louis, which is why you see a conglomeration of smaller boroughs in terms of territory in the city. In the city, those boroughs are given names with nod to historical figures or eras. You see Thomas Jefferson as a nod to the Louisiana Purchase, Malamphy, Brian Malamphy, John O'Fallon, Pierre Laclede, Pierre Chouteau, Tower Grove, Shaw's Garden, and so on. Mike, if you want to go back, it may be hard to see, but the largest borough was actually Ladue, which very interestingly enough went from Brentwood Boulevard all the way to the Franklin County line. That's pretty big. But there weren't very many people living in out now what we would call Chesterfield and Wildwood and that part of the country, so of the county. Fast forward. So this did go to a public vote. Not dissimilar to our last presidential election. Going into the election, the polling was running 50-50. Nobody was predicted. There were big proponents on both sides, people who thought we would be crazy not to do it, and people thought we would be crazy to do it. when the votes were counted. It did ultimately fail with a combined 61.5% no in the city and the county. That was the end of the borough plan. And not much talk on this issue for about 30 years. In the 1980s, County Executive Gene McNary floated an idea to consolidate the municipalities in St. Louis County from over 80 to the 20 that you see here. That didn't get very far. You want to fast forward again, Mike? Better Together, until relatively recently, was talking about this issue again. This map from the East-West Gateway Coordinating Council shows, and you can fast forward, there's a blow up, shows the fragmentation of our area. Of course, you see the city of St. Louis, big on the right, and of course, Wildwood big on the left, and in between them, jammed a whole bunch of municipalities. I think there's 91, if I'm not mistaken, when it comes down to it. So this is what we have now. It's what we're stuck with, and it's what we got to make work. So, last map of the evening is this map. This is an example of a pictorial map, a map that kind of shows its information and data visually instead of like a traditional map with streets. It does it through pictures, essentially. Now you see the very kind of, I think, defining features of our region that you see in most of these maps. You see the river along the bottom. St. Louis at the big bend in the Mississippi River. The artist who created this, his name is Dan Zetwak. He's a talented local artist. He has drawn in most of the major highways. You see 55 and 64, 70, 44. But what he wanted to highlight in this map was the depth and breadth of museums in our region. And this map was created for a 2017 convention that was held in St. Louis. It was the annual meeting and museum expo of an organization called the American Alliance of Museums. And in the spring of 2017, more than 6,000 museum professionals came from all over the world to St. Louis to learn about the latest museum trends and practices. And as part of that, the welcoming committee, the organizing committee rather for that convention commissioned this map to show those conventioneers, like I said, the depth and breadth of museums that we have to offer. If you want to fast forward, Mike. Here you can see just in the downtown area under the Gateway Arch, each little kind of red dot is the location, approximate location of a museum, and you have to follow the arrow to figure out what that was. There are libraries and house museums and history museums and parks and gardens, a wide variety done in a very kind of charming and delightful way, I think. The artist who created this, Dan Zetwak, you can fast forward, is a map lover himself, and he's been commissioned to create a number of maps of St. Louis, including this St. Louis beer map, which highlights most of the craft breweries here in St. Louis. This is the latest third edition of this map showing breweries all across our regions, from the big one, the Anheuser-Busch, to the smallest and newest ones. Dan was also commissioned to create this, the Anniversary Emos Pizza Box, showing the original Emos Pizza location, as you can see, is illustrated at Shaw and Thurman Avenue, just east of the Botanical Garden. And of course, in 1964, they were building the arch, and I love how he's depicted them building the arch with pizza squares and toasted raviolis. I'm going to leave you with this view of St. Louis from 1859. It's not a map, obviously. It's more of a view, a bird's eye view. I love it because it shows St. Louis on our big bend in the river, which is, I think, had been apparent on all these maps that we sit in this big kind of curve in the river. I love the commotion of the riverfront, dozens and dozens of steamboats. This, you have to remember, was St. Louis's front door. This is how in 1859, everyone came to St. Louis and left St. Louis, because everyone did that on a boat. You didn't take a train yet, because the trains weren't really coming to this part of the world easily. And you wouldn't take a wagon because it would take you too long to get anywhere on a wagon. So the boat was the way to go, whether you went up the Mississippi, down the Mississippi, east on the Ohio, west on the Missouri, the river was everything. But what I love most about this view, well, and the last thing is, second to last thing is the fact that it says our city on the bottom. And in case you didn't know what that was, it says in little parentheses under that St. Louis Mo. But what I really love about this map is the fact that it just shows this beautiful horizon, the West. St. Louis has always been about the West. The city was founded here because it was an outpost on the West where you could go west and trade. People came here because it was the gateway to the West, and our eyes have always been focused west. That's the way these maps have all been focused as well, if you haven't already noticed. And all of these maps, and until relatively recently, all St. Louis maps are orientated with the West at the top. Today, we would always orient them with the West on the right. Or I say with the West, what am I saying? Yeah, the North is on the right. Today, we would always orientate a map with the North on the top, the West on the left. Had to talk myself out of that hole there. So, but historically, maps of St. Louis are always orientated this way, just like this view. East on the bottom, west on the top, north on the right, because this is the way that St. Louis looks. It looks to the west. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief look at St. Louis, and I hope it's given you kind of a little bit more perspective about, where we've been as a city, how we've grown and changed. And I guess it's up to us to make the maps of the future to see where we will grow and go from here. But thank you.
First ask from the people in the room if anybody has any questions.
Yes, sir.
Here, can you?
I'll just repeat it.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Mosaic Museum on that museum chart,
Yes.
is that the facility?
Yeah. See, the museum map from 2017 noted the Mosaic Museum, and that's the museum in the basement of the Cathedral Basilica. Yeah. Dan.
So how did you come about finding that Spanish map? Did you somehow know it existed or just thought it existed?
So Dan asked, how did I come find out? You're talking about the one from 1767.
Yeah.
So I knew it because it was relatively recent, about 12 years ago, published in a book about colonial era St. Louis. But it was like a postcard or even smaller. It had also been printed in an older book about colonial St. Louis in the 1940s. So I was aware of it, but so I just went, the most recent book had a credit for it. So it's in Spain. Google translated the internet, made it possible for me to contact the library, get access to it, and very easily they sent it right away. And when I got it and could really blow it up, I was just amazed at the amount of detail on it. It's really kind of a special map.
Presentation was fascinating. I'm particularly interested in those forts, but I hope someday that we might make a map that connects that third of the Native American mound with the arsenal, maybe the brewery, whatever, but that area which is going to be abandoned shortly and is a major part of our history.
You're talking about the arsenal site.
The arsenal and the Osage Native American.
Yeah, just south of there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's something he asked about, the U.S. Arsenal, which is currently the site of NGA, which will be moving up to North City. So that is something that preservationists are talking about. What's going to become of that site. I don't think the federal government's going to get rid of it. How more easily it will be to access that site, because there are many historic buildings on that site, buildings that are almost 200 years old on that site that no one can really get access to, or at least easily. I've been there once, but you had to submit your passport a month in advance, and it wasn't easy to go through a security check. And so, so it'll be really interesting to see what happens. And that'll be a map of the future, what will be coming that site, how it will connect to the Osage side on the south. Yeah. Yes, Mike.
I have a question. One of your first maps depicted Duncan Island, which you said was washed away,
On the south, and Bloody Island on the north.
and Bloody Island, where a dike was built out
Correct.
to make the river flow faster,
Sure.
et cetera. And Blood Island or Bloody Island has an interesting story that was used for duels that weren't
Exactly.
in Illinois or Missouri,
Right.
so it was lawless.
It was kind of seen as no man's land.
Yes.
Exactly.
When did it go away?
Well, it's probably still there, but it's now part of Illinois. So that map that I showed you from 1837 shows a river that's almost twice as wide as the river at St. Louis today. So basically what happened is as part of began with Robert E. Lee, but we continue to engineer the river today. The river has been pushed right up against the Missouri side. And so most of what you see on the screen now at the bottom, that's river, most of that is now Illinois, including a significant part of Bloody Island. So it's probably still there. People have asked me in previous presentations, is the dike still there? And I don't think I think the answer to that is no. But it's probably under the Illinois levee, or was it approximately the side of the Illinois levee today? But it is probably still there.
Mhm.
So were there online
Doug,
questions?
any questions from people online?
Yeah, Riva asked, I think about the map of the boroughs, why all Olivet and Creve Coeur weren't included on that map.
Well, but they only chose, they had to divide the city and county up into 22 spots. And her comment, I think, perfectly illustrates the kind of tribalism, for lack of a better word, mentality that why isn't my spot on there? They just chose the biggest ones in those areas. And it's not that, they wiped Creve Coeur or Olivet off the map. They were just included in different areas. And what I probably didn't mention is each borough would have an elected representative in the city council, so to speak. So there would be 22 elected representatives, one from each borough, who would represent that area, that constituents in that area. So they're there, but they just don't exist in name anymore according to that plan. And I think, again, that's part of the issue with even kind of reorganizing our municipalities is people don't want to see their kingdom diminished, right? Even if their kingdom is only as big as a subdivision. So
Well, I've been in Olivet since 1960, so it's kind of weird. Okay, bye.
Anybody else, Doug?
Yeah, Nancy's got a question. Are there any Cyrus Crane Wilmore maps in development of St. Louis Hills? In the
I
book.
don't include any in the book, but there's quite a few very interesting maps of St. Louis Hills. And those would be great example of development or real estate maps. I did include one real estate map in the book, and that's an 1895 map of Compton Heights. And that's basically the map that was used to sell the subdivision, to sell the new neighborhood. And there were a number of similar maps for other neighborhoods in St. Louis, including St. Louis Hills. Like you go to the real estate office and they would have this huge map on the wall showing all the lots. And then you could kind of, pick some lots out in mind, and then you could actually drive out or walk out to that spot and you could see that lot. And, they would have them marked out and numbered so that you could get a sense of, is this the spot for me to buy and to build my house? So there's quite many examples of that in St. Louis history.
Denny Kempen noted, and I kind of noticed it too, is that we didn't know that the zoo had ever been located in Forest Park at the time of the fair. We thought it was up at Fairgrounds Park.
Well, there was kind of a zoo up there as well. They kept different type of animals up at Fairgrounds Park than down in Forest Park. The animals in Fairgrounds Park were what we consider more caged animals, bears, monkeys. The ones in Forest Park were more like free range animals, like buffalo and elk, antelope, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Because there was more ground in Forest Park than Fairgrounds Park. And it was there from almost the first days of Forest Park. I think by 1878, there's already records of the city paying to keep animals in pens in Forest Park.
Well, I count 28 people out there on Zoom land. Any other questions, Doug, or on chat?
Yeah,
or-
just one more, regarding Bloody Island. Is that where the casino is now?
Approximately at the south end of Bloody Island, it would be kind of where the casino is, which is kind of
Mhm.
an interesting take on it. But yeah, I think it would be just slightly north of there, just north of the Eads Bridge is about.
Mhm.
So, yeah. Well, thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you again for coming.
My pleasure.
And we have three things left on our agenda. First is to walk over here.
Okay.
And let me get a camera. And David, would you or somebody come and be our recorder of the presentation? Set up your camera. You and I are gonna walk over here for a moment, up against David, you may want to be over here and Garrett, you can take it off no, take it off the screen. It just lifts. There you go. And it's been our tradition in the World's Fair Society to give first-time presenters a token of our appreciation. It's the World's Fair Society logo in the middle of a block of acrylic. And I want to thank you for the
Thank you.
presentation and the information, because I think we've all learned something. And the next thing is, as I mentioned earlier, we have two spoons, and you get to determine who wins.
Okay.
You get to draw two names from the people who came up here today in this
Does
wonderful
the first
weather.
person get to get the first spoon, or do I get to pick who gets what spoon?
You can pick, or they can pick. They're similar spoons by the same manufacturer, two different palettes.
Tom Allen, electricity or mines? Electricity.
Thank you. And Tom, if you'll stay up here to pose with Andy for a photo. Mike?
That's ominous. Ollie C.
Hey.
Bye.
Mike, you're not in it? No.
Yay.
Gonna go eat your ice cream with that.
We usually have some dedicated people with cameras and phones and stuff like that to take pictures. And I thought since we were, working so well, more or less, I would finish this up with that and take pictures of it. I want to close with a quick overview of our future meetings that are coming up. On Tuesday, February 19th at 6:30 at University City Library, we're planning on having another new presentation from WashU instructor Dave Walsh. Along with the many historic pieces of art from all over the world, advances in communication, transportation, manufacturing, et cetera, advances in everything we're seeing at the fair. They foreshadowed the rest of the 20th century and what it might bring. And Dave will give us a presentation as he has studied that and written an essay that's included in the new book about the World's Fair, The Wonder and Complexity of the Fair. March's meeting and date are still being finalized, but I do have a presenter committed for March, and that's going to be a musical performance of Victorian music by Dave Mazak. Dave played keyboard at the 2024 banquet, and I think everybody had a really good time listening to his music. In April, we'll have two society events. The first on Tuesday, April 15th, tax day. I'll give a presentation at the History Museum about the pike. Also, we're considering hosting an opening day celebration, dinner and presentation like we did last year on Wednesday, April 30th at Pietro's. I think everyone had a good time socializing and enjoying a really, really good Italian dinner there. And then going into May, Saturday, May 17th is going to be our annual picnic. This year we'll return to Forest Park on our favorite picnic area number 11 with its own kind of semi-private restrooms and a nice little parking area right next to it. So Saturday, May 17th, mark your calendars for that. One last question. Does any attendee here or online have any final questions or inputs before we close the meeting? You can unmute yourself and just chip in with a question for our presenter, Andy, or some news. Yes, Holly.
So with the whole divide of city and county, did they fight over who was in charge of Forest Park?
The question was, with Forest Park being created in 1876, at about that same time, the city and county were dividing. Were they arm wrestling over Forest Park?
The park opened in June, vote was in November. And the Forest Park was always within the boundaries of the city of St. Louis. There was no.
They fought over money.
But yeah, but the vote didn't change the boundaries at all. It just separated them at the set boundary.
That's just out past, a little bit past Skinker.
Correct, yeah, within a stone.
So
throw of
Forest Park
but
was in
not-
the city limits for you Zoom people. I don't know if you heard the answer to the question. That's a very good question. I didn't realize the timing of those two things was right on top of each other. Okay, well, thanks for you coming, and we'll let you all go and drive home safely.
I forgot to mention, Mike, I do have
Oh.
the books here to buy.
Oh,
Anybody
yes,
wants one?
yes. For people here, Andy did bring a couple copies
Yeah.
of the book to buy.
$39.95. You could buy it from me, you could buy it at any bookstore, you could buy it at a grocery store. It's in all the libraries, so
And I have,
Amazon.
Amazon, definitely.
This is it, Mike?
yes, I have read it and not quite cover to cover, but I want your autograph in it. And if anybody is interested, please come up after.
Thanks, very good.
Anybody online want one? And you can pay me back? Guess not. Okay. Just thought I'd give that a shot. Thank you all for coming and attending, and stay warm.
Thanks all.
Close this.